Okay, so this step in the tutorial is just going to talk about the daylight system and exposure control affecting it, and also the mental ray physical sky. Now, if we look back at the last rendering that I made, we can see that I moved the sunlight to be in the back side of the building, but it's still kind of dark in here. Maybe the exposure settings aren't exactly what I want, and obviously I've got some things going on with this physical sky in the background as well. If you look really closely, you'll see that some of my surfaces I don't think, like the stripes here, are facing the right direction. So I've got some more normals to fix, but I'm going to ignore all of that and just focus on exposure control and the mental ray physical sky. So exposure control is found under the rendering tab under environment, which if you see here, you can just hit the number 8 to get to it. You can note exposure control as well, but it's inside the environment, and so 8 would have brought us to the same place. And you'll see that there is an exposure control assigned, which is the mental ray photographic exposure control setting, and it's turned to mental ray, and there's a preset, and it told us when it gave us that window that it was going to set an EV equal to 15. If we go to the presets, and we select indoor or outdoor daylight with a clear sky, physically based lighting, outdoor daylight, we'll see that it doesn't change from 15. Now, if for some reason we want it to be indoor during the daylight, you'll see that it changes to 10. So 15 was just the starting point. And as we lower that value, it's going to get a little bit brighter in our scene. So if I wanted to brighten up this area, maybe I'll drop that down to say 12 is going to be too much, but let's render that to see what we get. It's going to go ahead and think a second, and then it's going to render the wrong window. So let's click in here. I do this in class, so I'll just go ahead and roll with the punches. Let's click in the right window, and let's render that. Instead of doing a top-down view, we can see that it's already pretty bright there with a setting of 12. And we can see that we've totally burned out our scene. So I canceled that. Let's go back up to maybe 13 or maybe even 13 and a half. The point is just to brighten it up a little bit. So let's render it that way. And we can see it was about to burn everything out. And with this one, I may have found a medium point that I want. I don't mind the backside feeling like it's a little hot and bright, because I'm setting my exposure just like if I was changing the settings on a manual camera to let the film stay exposed a little bit longer so that I could get the right value of light in the center of my scene, where I really wanted to kind of pick up on and brighten up this courtyard, which was not totally in sun, right? It's got a little bit of shade going on. So I brightened up the scene. I changed the exposure control to achieve the results I wanted. Now, the exposure control is going to be critical once you get all your materials in here. You start to see how those are bouncing light. It's going to actually change once the materials are in there. It's going to change how the scene looks. But I just want to illustrate how adjusting the exposure control will affect the brightness of the scene. So if I stop that, I'm going to go in here and take the exposure control and set it up to 16. Or it won't let me do 17. 16 is the highest. And render that. Where I was below 15 before, so it brightened it up. Now I'm actually above 15, so it's going to darken my scene. So it's almost feeling now like a dusk shot. So you have control with that exposure control on the settings and how bright the sun is. You don't have to change the daylight system. You just change the brightness of the overall rendering, which is the same as if you had a different speed of film, or if you had a different shutter speed on your camera. It affects how the light actually affects the film and how that is going to be turned into an image and how bright that image is going to be. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is the mental ray physical sky. I stopped the last rendering, but when we look at it here, we can see it was going to be too dark. But we had that gradient sky, and that's coming from the MR physical sky. We have this horizon line, and we have a whole bunch of nothing down below it. So let's see if we can actually adjust that. Now, if I change the exposure control back to something else, the sky will look okay, but that horizon line is killing me. If you had created a bigger scene, a bigger site, which from a somewhat aerial view is necessary, you can imagine that you might have a little bit more ground out here. But I would expect that unless you made your ground just absolutely humongous, then this back horizon line still may be too high. So to edit that mental ray physical sky, it's a little tricky. If we go to rendering environment, we'll notice that there is an environmental map, and it's selected to use it, and it's called the MR physical sky. And if we go into there, it wants to replace it with something else, but we can't actually edit it. So this is kind of a leap of faith that you would understand, or the Autodesk would expect you to understand what to do here. But what you want to do is go into the material editor. And I mentioned in class before when we talked about materials that used to be called the material/map editor. And the reason for that was that you could actually drag and edit maps into one of the slots. So it's not just about materials. Let me try that again. Let me put that right there in that slot. And it says, do you want to instance it or copy it? And that's an important choice. If we copy it, any changes we make here will be to a copy of what's assigned to our scene, which means that it won't actually affect our scene. So I need to make an instance of the one that's assigned so that when it's instanced, anything I do to it will happen in both locations. That's what instance means. So it's important that we don't just copy it. And then we have to kind of figure out what's inside the physical sky. So when I look at the material editor and what's in here, well, the first thing we'll notice is that we can actually change the way the sun appears if it happens to be our camera's looking at it, but we'll leave that alone for now. Another area is to use a custom background map. Now let's say you don't like that nice little gradient sky. Why? Because you want some clouds, or maybe you want the background of the urban setting that you're in, like a skyline of some downtown. That's a whole nother lecture and a whole lot more information. So right now we won't click that. But we'll notice everything else is grayed out because it's just inheriting it from the default situation in the mental ray sky. And we can uncheck that, and then everything else here comes alive. If you look closely, you'll notice that you can actually put a haze into the sky, and you can use a map to control that haze. You can do some other things with what's happening after dark, like what's the sky night color and what's happening down here. But we're going to stay with the defaults, except for that horizon we didn't like. Remember, it had just a regular old gray horizon everywhere. And then it has a horizon height right now, which is 0, which we don't know what that means. You can change that color to anything you want. I'm going to change it to kind of just a deep green, like the grass and the ground. Give it a little bit more, get it closer to the yellows there, make it more like an actual ground color. Give it some depth, and just use a green so it's not gray. Or if you actually have a grass material selected the rest of your scene, you can use that same material here in the horizon or in the ground color of the horizon so that it makes more sense. But I'm going to leave it just a green, and then I'm going to try to figure out what does that horizon height of 0 mean. Well, because I was up high, 0 horizon is way out here with respect to my model. But what if I wanted to drop it down here for the purposes of just this rendering? It may be a little physically incorrect, but I'll just drop that horizon height. And I really don't know what -1 is in relation to how many feet I want to drop it. So let's just go -1.5. And remember, I dragged this instance into here and I'm editing it. So it's editing real time. This is like a hot material. Though it's not a material, it's a map. It's a hot map. And these changes are going to be real time. So that when I render it now, we should see a little bit different behavior in that background. And before I even let it do a lot of rendering, I'll at least get a sense for how low it dropped the horizon. In fact, -1.5 is way too low. So let me go ahead and cancel that. So this is a trial and error process because what's 0.7 negative, but you just want to go ahead and try to get a horizon line that hits where you want, because you don't want to lose too much of that gradient sky unless you're overriding the background with an actual photograph. And so I got a little bit more gradient. I'm not sure, well actually I do know because I changed the color of the horizon to that green color. So if that's still too high, we can cancel it again. So I changed my ground height for the horizon to -1.0, and we'll check that one more time. But the key is that we drug our environment map out of the environment into our material editor, which is hidden now behind this window that's coming in. And so that's -1.1. So if I want to drop it a little bit more, I just have to keep working until I get the horizon height to the exact level I wanted it to. I changed the environmental exposure control to get the balance of light that I wanted on the back of the scene. And then I played a little bit with my mental ray physical sky so that I could get the scene that I wanted. Now, if you go to a dusk shot or a twilight shot or the sun's just coming up, depending on where you're looking at it, these colors will really look realistic. So that mental ray physical sky is actually pretty nice, except for the fact that there's no clouds in the sky at all. So you'll want to find ways to animate the sky a little bit with some more background material. And we'll talk later about using custom backgrounds. But for now, just stay with the mental ray physical sky and see if you can adjust that horizon height to where you need it. Maybe even put a material or a color in so it doesn't look so gray and weird. That's what we wanted to talk about here with the exposure control. At least a simplified look at exposure control where we're only focused on exterior renderings. We'll talk more about it later when we get inside the building. And then a little bit about how you can actually drag your environment map into your material editor. If I cancel this guy and close it down, you'll see it's in my material editor and I can make some changes. And it's my Metro Ray Physical Sky. Doesn't have a name yet, but that's okay. You might want to actually name it, my MR Sky, just so that you know that's the one that you're working with. And it's right here, my MR Sky, and we're good to go. So that's the end of this tutorial. And next, we'll talk a little bit about